April 18, 1906, 5:12 a.m. A police officer on patrol heard it first. A low rumble coming from underground like a freight train approaching. Then the street beneath his feet began to move. Not shake. The pavement rolled in waves like the ocean. Buildings didn't just collapse. They twisted apart, floors pancaking onto each other while the walls remained standing. The earthquake lasted 48 seconds. But what happened in the 3 days after killed more people than the quake itself. And city officials spent the next century covering it up. The official death toll is 478. That's what's carved into monuments, printed in textbooks, displayed in museums. But here's what they don't tell you. The actual number was over 3,000, maybe 5,000. The city government deliberately undercounted deaths to protect real estate values and attract investors. They buried evidence, destroyed records, threatened witnesses. And the earthquake wasn't even the worst part. It was what the authorities did to save the city that turned a natural disaster into a massacre. These are 10 dark secrets about the San Francisco earthquake that changed how disasters are reported in America. And number 1 is why the military was given shoot-to-kill orders against American civilians. Number 10, the military dynamited hundreds of buildings that could have been saved and killed people inside them. Within hours of the earthquake, Mayor Eugene Schmitz declared martial law and gave the U.S. Army total authority over the city. Brigadier General Frederick Funston decided the spreading fires had to be stopped by creating fire breaks, deliberate gaps that fire couldn't cross. His solution: dynamite entire city blocks. The problem was that his soldiers had no training in controlled demolition. They used too much explosives. Buildings that survived the earthquake were blown apart, collapsing onto neighboring structures, actually spreading the fire instead of stopping it. But here's the truly dark part. Many buildings still had survivors inside. Residents trapped in basements after the quake, waiting for rescue, were killed when soldiers dynamited their buildings without checking for survivors first. One documented case on Hayes Street describes soldiers dynamiting a damaged boarding house. After the explosion, neighbors heard screaming from the rubble. 3 people had been trapped in the basement. The soldiers refused to dig them out, saying the fire was too close. All 3 burned to death. A journalist named James Hopper documented at least 20 cases of buildings dynamited with people still inside. His newspaper killed the story. The Army later claimed only structurally unsound buildings were destroyed. But post-earthquake surveys show that over 40% of dynamited buildings had been rated as reparable before soldiers blew them up. Which brings us to what happened to people who tried to stop the demolitions. Number 9. Civilians who tried to save their homes from military demolition were shot. The martial law order included a provision. Anyone interfering with Army operations could be killed on sight. Multiple accounts describe homeowners attempting to prevent soldiers from dynamiting their undamaged homes and being shot for it. On Nob Hill, a wealthy real estate developer named Charles Crocker confronted soldiers preparing to dynamite his mansion. When he refused to leave, soldiers physically removed him at gunpoint. His mansion was destroyed minutes later, even though fires were still 3 blocks away. But at least Crocker survived. On Howard Street, a man named Antonio Fava refused to evacuate his bakery, which had survived the quake intact. He argued that his building was brick, undamaged, and the fire was moving away from his block. When he physically blocked the door, a soldier shot him. Fava died on his own doorstep. The shooting was ruled justifiable under martial law conditions. No soldier was ever charged. The earthquake created a legal gray area where the military had absolute authority and zero accountability. Shoot-to-kill orders meant exactly that. Soldiers could execute civilians without trial, without witnesses, without documentation. How many people were shot trying to protect their property? There's no official count, because there was no requirement to report civilian shootings. Soldiers didn't document who they killed or why. The bodies were just added to the earthquake death toll. The official death toll itself was a deliberate lie. Number 8. City officials systematically undercounted deaths to protect real estate values. In the days after the quake, Mayor Schmitz and Southern Pacific Railroad President E.H. Harriman made a pact. Keep the death toll as low as possible to prevent economic panic. If the true number of deaths became public, property values would collapse. Investors would flee. Insurance companies would refuse to cover the city. So they buried the truth, literally. Coroner's records show only 478 confirmed deaths. But here's what happened to the real numbers. Chinatown deaths weren't counted. City officials claimed record-keeping in Chinatown was insufficient to determine casualties. Modern estimates suggest between 500 and 1,200 Chinese residents died. But because Chinese immigrants were denied basic civil rights in 1906, their deaths were simply excluded from official counts. They died. They were buried in mass graves. They just didn't count as San Francisco residents. The same with the poor. South of Market Street, the working-class district, was destroyed completely. Entire blocks of tenements collapsed. But because most residents were transient workers, immigrants, or homeless, officials claimed they couldn't verify residency. If you weren't on property rolls or tax records, your death didn't make the official list. Bodies pulled from the rubble with no identification were dumped in mass graves at the Presidio with no record, no count, no names. Just gone. A Red Cross nurse named Mabel Boardman kept her own count while treating survivors. Her private notes, discovered in 1989, list over 2,400 deaths she personally witnessed or documented at emergency hospitals. None of them appeared in official records. When she tried to publish the true numbers, Southern Pacific Railroad, the city's biggest employer, threatened her job. She stayed silent for the rest of her life. The undercounting extended to how they categorized deaths. Number 7. Deaths from fires after the earthquake were labeled fire deaths, not earthquake deaths, to reduce disaster statistics. Insurance companies had earthquake exclusions in their policies. If your building was destroyed by earthquake, insurance didn't have to pay. But if it burned in the fires after the earthquake, that was covered. So the city created a classification system. Anyone who died in fires after the initial quake was listed as a fire victim, not an earthquake casualty. This dropped the earthquake death toll dramatically while allowing insurance claims to proceed. But it also created a twisted incentive. Officials wanted people to have died in fires, not in building collapses, because it made the earthquake look less deadly while keeping insurance companies from going bankrupt. Bodies pulled from collapsed buildings were sometimes moved to burned areas and reclassified. A fire marshal named Dennis Sullivan, who himself died in the disaster, had documented this practice in his notes. After his death, those notes disappeared. His wife claimed the city confiscated them. Estimates suggest that 80% of deaths in the first 48 hours were actually earthquake-related, collapsed buildings, falling debris, infrastructure failures. But official records list only 10% as earthquake deaths. The rest were blamed on fire. Why does this matter? Because it shaped earthquake preparedness for decades. If the earthquake only killed 50 people and the fires killed 400, then the lesson seemed to be, earthquakes aren't that deadly, fires are. So California spent the next 50 years focused on fire prevention while ignoring seismic building codes. It wasn't until the 1971 San Fernando earthquake killed 65 people in earthquake-proof buildings that anyone questioned the 1906 narrative. But the darkest secret isn't about counting the dead. It's about who killed them. Number 6. Soldiers shot and killed looters on site without trial, but looters included people retrieving their own belongings from their destroyed homes. Martial law came with shoot-to-kill orders for looters. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, preventing criminal opportunism during a disaster. But the definition of looter was left to individual soldiers' discretion, and it was applied lethally. A soldier could decide you were looting and shoot you. No warning required. No trial. No documentation. You were just dead. People were shot for carrying their own possessions out of their damaged homes. One account describes a man shot on Market Street for carrying a suitcase. Soldiers assumed he'd stolen it. It contained his own clothes from his collapsed apartment. He died before he could explain. Another case on Mission Street. A woman was shot for carrying silverware in her apron. It was her family's silverware. She dug it out of her ruined kitchen. A soldier saw her, assumed she was looting, and shot her. She died instantly. How many people were executed as looters who were actually survivors trying to salvage their own belongings? Nobody knows, because soldiers weren't required to report shootings. Bodies were collected and added to the earthquake toll with no investigation of cause of death. A photographer named Arnold Jenth documented at least a dozen bodies lying in streets with bullet wounds, not earthquake injuries. When he tried to publish the photos, the army confiscated his negatives. Some historians estimate that as many as 100 to 200 people were shot by soldiers during the 3 days of martial law. But there's no way to verify because the military destroyed records after the disaster ended. The fires that consumed the city weren't all accidental. Number 5. The military deliberately set fires to destroy Chinatown, planning to rebuild it as white residential property. Before the earthquake, Chinatown occupied prime real estate near downtown. White business leaders had wanted that land for years. When the earthquake hit, they saw an opportunity. General Funston's soldiers didn't just dynamite Chinatown to create fire breaks. They set fires after dynamiting, ensuring complete destruction. Multiple witnesses reported soldiers pouring kerosene on rubble and lighting it. Why? Because city officials had already drawn up plans to relocate Chinatown to Hunters Point, miles from downtown, and sell the land to developers. A city planning memo from April 20, 1906, just 2 days after the quake, outlined the Chinatown Removal and Redevelopment Initiative. The memo stated that the fire presents an opportunity to address the Chinese district problem permanently. Chinese community leaders fought back. They hired lawyers, produced property deeds, and demanded the right to rebuild. It took 2 years of legal battles, but they eventually won. Chinatown was rebuilt in its original location, but only after Chinese organizations proved they owned the land and threatened federal intervention. Here's the truly dark part. During those 2 years, Chinese residents were forced into refugee camps while their land sat empty. White developers bought surrounding properties at disaster prices, profiting from the displacement. And the soldiers who deliberately burned Chinatown? Never investigated, never charged. Their actions were classified as fire suppression operations. The refugee camps themselves became prisons. Number 4. Refugee camps were racially segregated and non-white survivors were given fewer resources and forced to stay longer. After the earthquake, the army set up refugee camps throughout the city and in Golden Gate Park. In theory, these provided shelter, food, and medical care to displaced residents. In reality, they were segregated. White refugees were housed in the Presidio camps, the best locations with the most resources. They received full meals, medical care, and were allowed to leave freely. Chinese, Japanese, and black refugees were sent to separate camps with fewer supplies, less food, and stricter rules. Camp Chinatown at the edge of Golden Gate Park housed over 3,000 Chinese refugees in conditions described by relief workers as inhumane. A Red Cross nurse reported that Camp Chinatown received half the food rations of white camps despite having more residents. Medical care was minimal. A smallpox outbreak in the camp killed at least 50 people before doctors arrived. But here's the darkest part. Refugees in segregated camps weren't allowed to leave without military permission. White refugees could come and go freely, finding housing and work. Non-white refugees needed signed exit permits from army commanders. What? City officials feared that if Chinese and black refugees returned to their neighborhoods, they'd reclaim land that developers wanted. So they were deliberately kept in camps while the city was rebuilt without them. Some families were held in camps for over 6 months. By the time they were released, their properties had been seized for abandonment and sold to white buyers. This wasn't accidental. It was policy. A city supervisor named James Phelan, who later became a U.S. Senator, explicitly stated in a 1906 speech, "The earthquake gives us an opportunity to remake San Francisco as it should be, a white American city." The insurance industry used the disaster to commit systematic fraud. Number 3. Insurance companies denied legitimate claims by reclassifying earthquake damage as fire damage not covered by earthquake exclusions. This sounds backwards, but here's how the scam worked. Most policies in 1906 covered fire but excluded earthquake damage. So if your building collapsed in the quake, insurance didn't pay. But if it burned in the fires after, insurance had to pay. Policyholders whose buildings collapsed in the earthquake submitted fire claims, arguing that while the building was damaged by the quake, it was destroyed by fire. Insurance companies agreed this interpretation. For white policyholders in wealthy neighborhoods, they paid those claims. But for poor neighborhoods, immigrants, and minorities, insurance companies reversed the logic. They argued, your building was damaged by earthquake first, so even though it burned later, the earthquake was the primary cause. Claim denied. Same disaster. Same sequence of events. Opposite rulings based entirely on who was filing. Chinese business owners in Chinatown were hit hardest. Their buildings collapsed, then burned. They had fire insurance. Claims were systematically denied on the grounds that earthquake damage was the proximate cause. Meanwhile, white-owned buildings in the financial district that also collapsed then burned had their fire claims approved. A Chinese Merchants Association sued Hartford Insurance in 1907. The case revealed internal memos instructing adjusters to minimize payouts in undesirable areas and prioritize claims that support city rebuilding in appropriate zones. Hartford settled out of court with a gag order. Modern estimates suggest insurance companies defrauded policyholders out of $200 to $300 million in 1906 dollars, equivalent to about $6 billion today. And they got away with it because courts sided with insurers, ruling that claim determinations were at company discretion. The water system failure wasn't entirely natural. Number 2. City officials knew the water system was seismically vulnerable but refused to upgrade it because the head of the water department was taking bribes from construction contractors. San Francisco's water department was run by a political appointee named William Herron. Engineers had warned since 1904 that the city's water mains were vulnerable to earthquake damage. They recommended installing flexible joints and redundant lines. Estimated cost, $2 million. Herron rejected the proposal. Why? Because the existing water main contractor was paying him kickbacks to avoid expensive upgrades. When the earthquake hit, the water mains shattered in over 300 locations. The city had no water to fight the fires. Firefighters watched helplessly as the city burned because hydrants ran dry. Here's the truly criminal part. After the disaster, Herron was not only not charged, he was put in charge of rebuilding the water system. And he awarded the contracts to the same companies that had paid him bribes before the earthquake. A city engineer named Marsden Manson tried to expose the corruption. He documented the bribery, the ignored safety warnings, and Herron's profiteering from disaster contracts. When he took his evidence to the mayor, he was fired and blacklisted. His engineering license was revoked on fabricated ethics charges. Manson died in poverty in 1915. Herron retired wealthy in 1920. Modern analysis estimates that if the water system had been properly upgraded, firefighters could have contained the fires to maybe 20% of the area that actually burned. Instead, 80% of the city was destroyed. Thousands died. Because one man took bribes and the city protected him. And now, the secret that explains why martial law was so brutal. Number 1. The military had standing orders to shoot anyone who appeared to be spreading information about the true scale of the disaster. This sounds like conspiracy theory, but it's documented in military communications discovered in 1979 at the Presidio Archives. General Funston received orders from the Secretary of War. Prevent panic and preserve order by controlling information flow. In practice, this meant soldiers were authorized to stop anyone attempting to send telegrams, make phone calls, or transport written messages out of the disaster zone. If someone refused to hand over communications, soldiers could detain them. If they resisted detention, soldiers could use lethal force. What? The federal government feared that if the true scale of destruction became public, it would cause a financial panic. San Francisco was the economic hub of the West Coast. If investors thought the city was gone, they'd pull out of California entirely. So information was controlled. Telegraph operators were ordered to send only approved messages cleared by military censors. A telegraph operator named Henry Payot refused. He attempted to send an uncensored message to New York describing the true death toll and scale of fires. Soldiers arrested him. When he fought back, he was shot. He survived but was held in military detention for 3 days without charges, then released with a warning. Journalists who tried to report the true scope were expelled from the city. One reporter from the Chicago Tribune was forcibly put on a ferry to Oakland with orders not to return. Photographers had their equipment confiscated. Arnold Jenth, the photographer who documented bullet-riddled bodies, had his studio raided by soldiers who destroyed negatives of anything deemed harmful to civic morale. Here's the evidence that proves this was policy, not isolated incidents. A military order dated April 19, 1906, one day after the quake, lists information control as a primary objective, alongside fire suppression and maintaining order. The order specifically authorizes physical intervention up to and including lethal force to prevent dissemination of demoralizing information. This order wasn't declassified until 1979. For 73 years, the military denied it existed. 10 dark secrets about the San Francisco earthquake. The military dynamited buildings with survivors inside. Civilians were shot for protecting their homes. The death toll was systematically undercounted. Fire deaths were reclassified to hide earthquake danger. People were executed as looters for retrieving their own belongings. Chinatown was deliberately burned for land theft. Refugee camps were segregated prisons. Insurance companies defrauded policyholders by race. City officials caused the water failure through corruption. And the military shot people to suppress the truth. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake killed somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people. But the earthquake itself only killed about 500. The rest died from what came after: bad decisions, corruption, racism, greed, and a government that cared more about property values than human lives. The official story is about nature's power and human resilience. The real story is about how disasters reveal what governments do when they think nobody's watching. The truth about 1906 wasn't fully uncovered until the 1980s and 90s, when researchers finally accessed military archives, insurance company records, and sealed city documents. What they found was systematic cover-up spanning 80 years. Why does this matter now? Because it shaped how disasters are managed in America. The 1906 response became the template. Declare martial law, control information, protect economic interests, undercount casualties, and bury evidence. It happened again after Katrina, after Maria, after every disaster where the official story doesn't match what survivors report. Which secret disturbed you most? The deliberate undercounting? The shoot-to-kill orders against civilians? The racial segregation of refugee camps? The comments always reveal what aspects of government overreach resonate with different people. And if you want to know what happened to the survivors who tried to tell the truth, the journalists who were silenced, the photographers who fought back, the engineers who exposed corruption, that's the next story. Because the cover-up didn't end in 1906. It continued for almost a century.